The wind howled through the valley, carrying the icy bite of the approaching storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to echo Elias's growing unease. His lantern swung in his hand, casting fleeting patches of light on the rocky path ahead. "Where are you?" Elias muttered, his voice barely audible over the gale. The lost lamb's absence had been noted at dusk when Elias was doing his final head count of the flock. At first he thought it might have wandered a short distance, but as darkness fell, worry crept into his heart. This lamb was special, frail and timid, always trailing behind the others. Elias adjusted his coat against the biting wind and pushed forward. His boots crunched against the uneven ground as he climbed the incline. The storm clouds above seemed to swirl menacingly, blotting out the moonlight. He glanced back at the dim lights of his cabin, now barely visible through the dense trees. For a moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Should he turn back? The storm was worsening and the search was growing more dangerous by the minute. But as quickly as the thought came, Elias dismissed it. He thought of the lamb's fragile form, huddled and defenseless against the cold. It was his responsibility to protect it, no matter the cost. The trail ahead twisted sharply, and Elias slowed his pace. The lantern's dim light illuminated jagged rocks and patches of mud, making every step treacherous. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, pitiful bleating carried on the wind. Elias stopped, straining to listen. The bleating came again, distant but unmistakable. Relief mixed with urgency as he quickened his pace, careful not to lose his footing. "Hold on, little one," he murmured, his voice firm with determination. As he neared the source of the sound, Elias's mind wandered to his father's words from years ago. "A shepherd doesn't just guard his flock," his father had said. "He pursues the lost, no matter the cost. Each life matters, even the smallest." Elias felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't always lived by that creed. Memories of his younger days surfaced, times when pride and ambition had taken precedence over compassion. Perhaps this search was about more than the lamb. It was about making amends, both to himself and to a past he had tried to forget. The bleating grew louder, but so did the storm. Rain began to fall, cold and unrelenting, soaking through Elias's coat. The wind whipped against his face, and he shielded his lantern, its flame flickering dangerously. Suddenly, his foot caught on something hard, and he stumbled, catching himself on a nearby rock. Elias shone the lantern down. There, partially hidden beneath a cluster of mossy stones, was something unusual, a small pile of rocks arranged deliberately, almost like a marker. He stared at it, a chill creeping down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm. "Who placed this here?" he whispered, his voice lost to the wind. Elias pressed onward, the marker weighing heavily on his thoughts. The path became steeper, and his muscles ached with the effort of climbing. Each step was a battle against the elements, but the bleating was closer now, spurring him on. Finally, he reached a plateau where the sound echoed clearly. He held up the lantern, its faint glow cutting through the rain. His eyes scanned the area, and there, near the edge of a rocky ledge, he saw it. The lamb was huddled in the mud, its small body trembling. It bleated weakly, lifting its head to look at him. Relief washed over Elias, but it was short-lived. The ledge where the lamb lay was dangerously narrow, with sheer drops on either side. One wrong move could send both of them tumbling into the abyss. "Easy now," Elias murmured, lowering himself to his knees. He inched forward, his heart pounding with every movement. The storm raged around him, and the rocks beneath his hands were slick with rain. When he was close enough, he reached out cautiously. The lamb flinched, but didn't move away, its trust overriding its fear. Elias scooped the animal into his arms, cradling it against his chest. Its fur was soaked and cold, and it let out a soft bleat, as if in gratitude. Elias's relief was short-lived as the wind howled louder and a deafening crack of thunder reverberated through the air. He glanced at the path he had taken and realized it was almost entirely washed out by the rain. Clutching the lamb tightly, Elias steeled himself. "We're going to get out of here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. He took a deep breath and began the treacherous journey back. The weight of the lamb in his arms, a reminder of the fragile life he was determined to save. The rain showed no signs of relenting as Elias trudged along the slippery path, the lamb cradled tightly in his arms. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than duty. The lantern in his hand flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows on the surrounding trees. Elias glanced at the lamb. Its small, fragile body trembled, but it was alive, a fact that filled him with equal parts relief and urgency. "Not much further," he whispered, though the words felt as much for himself as for the lamb. The trail narrowed as he climbed higher, the rain turning the ground to a thick, treacherous mud. As he fought for footing, memories from long ago began to surface, unbidden. Elias had not always been a shepherd. Once he was a young man full of ambition, eager to leave the quiet simplicity of his father's flock behind. He had sought a life in the city, trading pastures for crowded markets and the bleating of sheep for the clamor of business. His father, a man of quiet faith and steady hands, had begged him to stay. "The flock needs you," he had said. But Elias had been too stubborn to listen. Years later, when the city's promises of wealth and success proved hollow, Elias returned, only to find that time had taken its toll. His father's health had waned, and the once thriving flock was now smaller, weaker, struggling to survive. Elias had tried to make amends, but his father's words haunted him. "You cannot lead the flock if your heart is elsewhere." A flash of lightning pulled Elias back to the present, illuminating the path ahead in a stark white light. The wind howled, carrying with it the eerie sound of creaking branches and the distant roar of thunder. The lamb bleated softly, drawing Elias's attention. Its wide, frightened eyes seemed to plead with him for reassurance. "You're safe now," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. But as he spoke, he couldn't help but wonder if he was speaking to himself as well. The path took another sharp turn, leading him to a clearing. Here the storm seemed to pause, the trees providing a brief reprieve from the relentless rain. Elias lowered himself onto a large, flat rock and set the lamb gently on his lap. It nestled into his coat, its small frame still trembling, but no longer struggling. For a moment, Elias allowed himself to breathe. The journey back to the flock would be long, but this small clearing offered a moment of respite, a chance to reflect. As the lamb drifted into a restless sleep, Elias's thoughts returned to his father. He remembered a particular evening years ago when they had sat together by the fire after a long day of tending the flock. His father had spoken of the parable of the lost sheep, a story Elias had heard countless times in his youth. "It's not about the sheep," his father had said, his voice low but firm. "It's about the shepherd's heart, the willingness to leave the 99 for the one. That's what makes a shepherd." At the time, Elias had dismissed the words as nothing more than his father's musings. But now, with the lamb in his arms and the storm raging around him, those words took on a weight he hadn't understood before. The lamb stirred, letting out a faint bleat that brought Elias back to the present. He looked down at the tiny creature, its fragile body a stark reminder of how easily life could be lost. "It's not about the sheep," Elias repeated softly, as if testing the words on his tongue. For years, he had carried the guilt of leaving his father and the flock behind. Even after returning, he had struggled to reconcile his past mistakes with the man he wanted to be. But tonight, in the midst of the storm, he felt a shift, an understanding that redemption wasn't found in grand gestures, but in small, faithful acts. The sound of a snapping branch broke the stillness of the clearing. Elias tensed, his eyes scanning the shadows. The storm had quieted for the moment, but the forest was alive with other dangers. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, sending a chill down Elias's spine. He rose slowly, the lamb cradled in one arm while his other hand reached for the staff slung across his back. From the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of a wolf. Elias's grip on the staff tightened as he stepped protectively in front of the lamb. The wolf snarled, its hackles raised, but it didn't advance. "Stay back," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The wolf seemed to hesitate, its eyes locking onto Elias's. For a moment, man and beast stood frozen, the storm's distant rumble the only sound between them. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and disappeared into the trees. Elias exhaled deeply, his heart pounding. The encounter left him shaken, but resolved. He adjusted his coat, ensuring the lamb was secure, and resumed his journey. The storm began to pick up again, the rain falling in heavy sheets. But Elias pressed on, the clearing and the wolf's eyes lingering in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, that this journey was about more than just saving a lamb. The storm's fury grew with every passing minute, the rain now pounding against Elias's back as he trudged through the forest. His steps were slow and deliberate, each one sinking into the slick mud that threatened to pull him down. The lamb remained tucked against his chest, its small body providing a fragile sense of purpose amidst the chaos. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the path ahead for a brief, blinding moment. That was when Elias saw it. The faint outline of a steep ravine cutting through the forest floor. He stopped, his breath catching. The lamb's earlier bleating had been faint, but now it came clearly from below. Elias carefully approached the edge of the ravine, his lantern barely cutting through the shadows. The ground was loose and crumbled slightly beneath his boots, forcing him to crouch for balance. Peering down, he spotted the lamb, another one, not the one in his arms, trapped on a narrow ledge several feet below. Its white coat was muddied, and its small frame trembled as it tried to stand. His heart sank. The ledge was precarious, flanked by jagged rocks on one side and a sheer drop on the other. One wrong move, and the lamb would fall into the abyss. Elias placed the first lamb carefully on the ground near his feet. It bleated softly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. He scanned the area for a way down. The rain had turned the slope into a slick, unstable mess. The rope he carried might hold, but the climb would be dangerous. He hesitated, his mind racing with doubt. A voice echoed in his thoughts, the memory of his father once again. You cannot call yourself a shepherd if you are unwilling to risk everything for the lost. Steeling himself, Elias anchored one end of the rope to a sturdy tree and looped the other around his waist. He tested the knot, pulling it tight before glancing back at the lamb near his feet. "Stay here," he murmured, though he knew the animal wouldn't understand. With a deep breath, he began his descent. The slope was more treacherous than it had appeared. Mud and loose rocks gave way beneath his boots, forcing him to grip the rope with all his strength. The rain streamed into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he kept his focus on the lamb below. Halfway down, his foot slipped, his body jerked against the rope, sending a sharp pain through his arms as he scrambled to regain his footing. "Stay calm," he told himself, his voice barely audible over the storm. When he finally reached the ledge, the lamb was huddled in the far corner, its body pressed tightly against the rock wall. Its wide eyes locked onto Elias, a mixture of fear and desperation evident in its gaze. Elias crouched low, extending a hand slowly. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft and steady. "I'm here to help." The lamb hesitated, but didn't move away. Encouraged, Elias edged closer, his movements careful and deliberate. Just as he reached the lamb, a loud crack of thunder reverberated through the air, startling the animal. It stumbled, its hooves slipping dangerously close to the edge. Elias lunged, grabbing the lamb and pulling it toward him. His heart raced as he cradled the trembling creature against his chest. "You're safe now," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. The hardest part was still ahead. He secured the lamb in a makeshift sling tied to his chest, freeing his hands for the climb back up. The rain had intensified, turning the ravine into a torrent of water and mud. Every step was a battle against gravity and the elements. The rope strained under his weight, the fibers creaking ominously as he pulled himself upward. Halfway up, a sudden gust of wind knocked him sideways. He slammed against the rock face, the impact sending a sharp pain through his shoulder. Elias gritted his teeth, refusing to let go. The lamb bleated softly, its warmth against his chest a reminder of why he couldn't give up. When he finally reached the top, Elias collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The lamb near his feet nudged his arm gently, as if checking on him. He untied the sling and set the rescued lamb down beside its companion. Both animals huddled together, their small forms a testament to his determination. For a moment, Elias simply lay there, the rain washing over him. His body ached and his hands were raw from the climb, but he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was then that he noticed something unusual. Near the base of the tree where he had anchored the rope was another marker. A cross made of 2 sticks tied together with twine. Elias stared at it, his mind racing. The markers weren't random. Someone or something had placed them along his path. A surge of emotion welled within him, a mixture of awe and gratitude. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone on this journey. Elias gathered the lambs and began the trek back to his flock. The storm had eased slightly, the rain now a steady drizzle. As he walked, his thoughts turned inward. The markers, the storm, the lambs, it all felt too significant to be mere coincidence. He whispered a prayer of thanks, his voice breaking with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, as if the weight he had been carrying was beginning to lift. The drizzle continued as Elias trudged through the forest, the 2 lambs close by his side. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body aching from the strain of the rescue. Yet amidst the physical exhaustion, a quiet resolve had taken root within him. The markers on the trail still lingered in his thoughts. The deliberate placement of the crosses and the timing of their discovery, it all felt too profound to ignore. Elias stopped to rest under a large oak tree, its canopy offering some shelter from the rain. He crouched beside the lambs, their small forms huddled together for warmth. Reaching into his coat pocket, he retrieved a piece of cloth and gently dried their soaked fur. "You 2 have been through quite the storm," he murmured, his voice soft. "But you're safe now. That's all that matters." As he tended to the lambs, Elias felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper. The act of saving these vulnerable creatures had awakened a part of him he had long buried. Memories of his father surfaced once more, this time accompanied by a pang of regret. Elias had spent years running from the lessons his father had tried to teach him, dismissing them as irrelevant to the life he thought he wanted. But now, in the stillness of the forest, those lessons resonated with a clarity he hadn't experienced before. His father's words echoed in his mind. A shepherd's duty isn't just to protect, it's to seek out the lost, to care for the weak, and to love without condition. Elias looked down at the lambs, their small bodies pressed against his leg. For the first time, he truly understood what those words meant. The journey back to the flock was slow and arduous. The rain had turned the path into a muddy quagmire, and the lambs struggled to keep up. Elias paused frequently, lifting the lambs over patches of deep mud or carrying them when the terrain became too difficult. Each step tested his endurance, but he refused to falter. As they ascended a steep hill, Elias spotted a faint glow in the distance, the light from his cabin. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the realization that his journey wasn't over yet. Reaching the hill's crest, Elias stopped to catch his breath. The lambs bleated softly, their voices harmonizing with the sounds of the forest. He glanced back at the path he had taken. The storm, now a distant memory. The markers, the ravine, the lambs, all of it felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. Kneeling on the wet ground, Elias bowed his head. His lips moved in a quiet prayer, words of gratitude spilling forth with a raw honesty he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling, "for guiding me, for protecting them, for not giving up on me." When Elias finally reached the cabin, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. He opened the door and ushered the lambs inside, their tiny hooves clicking against the wooden floor. The cabin was warm and inviting, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls. Elias set the lambs near the fire, watching as they curled up together, their eyes heavy with sleep. He sank into a nearby chair, his body aching but his heart full. The warmth of the fire seeped into his bones, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Elias's gaze wandered to a small shelf above the hearth, where an old, worn Bible rested. He hadn't opened it in years, but tonight, something compelled him to reach for it. Flipping through the pages, he stopped at a familiar passage. Luke 15:4-7, the parable of the lost sheep. His father's voice seemed to echo in the room as he read the words aloud. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it?" Tears welled in Elias's eyes as he finished the passage. The story he had once dismissed as irrelevant now felt deeply personal. The lambs stirred, drawing Elias's attention. He set the Bible aside and knelt beside them, his fingers brushing against their soft fur. "You're more than just sheep," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You're reminders of what I've forgotten, of what I've lost, and what I can still find." The lambs seemed to sense his emotion, their wide eyes gazing up at him with an almost human understanding. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Elias made a silent promise. He would no longer run from his past or ignore the lessons his father had tried to teach him. The markers, the storm, the lambs, they were all signs, guiding him back to the path he was meant to walk. With a deep breath, Elias rose and began preparing for the next day. The flock needed him, and he was ready to answer the call. The morning broke gently, with rays of golden sunlight streaming through the cabin's frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside drenched but calm. Elias stirred in his chair, the crackling of the dying fire pulling him from a restless sleep. The lambs were curled up beside the hearth, their small bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Elias smiled faintly, the sight filling him with a rare sense of contentment. But as he stretched his stiff limbs, a familiar weight settled in his chest. The flock was still waiting for him, scattered in the hills. The 2 lambs, though safe, were just a fragment of his responsibility. Elias gathered his supplies, checking the ropes and feed sacks with practiced efficiency. His hands worked quickly, but his mind lingered on the events of the night before. The markers, the ravine, the overwhelming feeling that he wasn't walking this path alone. It was all too much to dismiss. He reached for the Bible on the mantel, its worn leather cover warm under his touch. For a moment, he hesitated, then slipped it into his satchel. "Just in case," he muttered to himself, though he knew the words held deeper meaning. The lambs followed him outside, their small hooves hesitant on the muddy ground. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves shaken loose by the storm. Elias adjusted his satchel and set off toward the pasture. The lambs trailed close behind, their trust in him unwavering. As he walked, the air felt lighter, as if the world itself had been cleansed. The mud squelched beneath his boots, but the path was clear, illuminated by the soft morning light. Midway through his journey, Elias spotted movement in the distance. His heart quickened as he recognized the familiar shapes of his flock clustered near a tree line. Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by the sight of a figure standing among the sheep. Elias's pace slowed. The figure was tall and cloaked, their back turned as they appeared to examine the flock. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice firm but cautious. The figure turned, and Elias's breath caught. It was a man, his face partially obscured by the hood of his cloak, but there was something familiar about him, a presence that tugged at the edges of Elias's memory. The man raised a hand in greeting, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've done well, shepherd," he said, his voice deep and steady. Elias frowned, his grip tightening on the staff in his hand. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer, his gaze steady and calm. "A friend," he said simply, "one who has walked a path similar to yours." Elias's unease softened, replaced by curiosity. There was something about the man's presence that felt both unsettling and comforting, like standing in the shadow of a great mountain. The man gestured to the lambs at Elias's feet. "They trust you," he said, "because they know you will not abandon them." Elias nodded slowly, his grip on the staff relaxing. "It's my duty," he said. The man smiled faintly. "It's more than that. It's a reflection of your heart." Elias's chest tightened at the words, the weight of his guilt pressing against him. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I've let others down." The man's gaze softened. "We all stray from the path at times, but the true measure of a shepherd is not perfection, it's the willingness to return, to seek out the lost, and to bring them home." Elias swallowed hard, the man's words cutting through him with an undeniable truth. Before he could respond, the man turned and began to walk away, his cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. "Wait!" Elias called after him. "Who are you, really?" The man paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "One who was also found," he said simply. Then, with a nod, he disappeared into the trees. Elias stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The man's presence lingered, a quiet strength that filled the air long after he was gone. As he approached the flock, the sheep lifted their heads, their bleats a chorus of welcome. Elias moved among them, checking for injuries and ensuring they were all accounted for. The two lambs, now reunited with the others, seemed to settle easily, their earlier fear replaced by a quiet confidence. Elias knelt in the grass, his hands resting on the damp earth. He closed his eyes, the words of the stranger echoing in his mind. In the stillness of that moment, Elias felt a shift within him, a loosening of the guilt that had bound him for so long. He opened his satchel and pulled out the Bible, flipping once again to the parable of the lost sheep. This time the words felt alive, their meaning resonating deeply in his heart. "Rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep." A tear slipped down Elias's cheek, but it was not one of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of gratitude, of a soul finding its way back to the light. As the sun climbed higher, Elias rose and began to lead the flock back toward the pasture. His steps were steady, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The forest seemed to hum with life, the remnants of the storm fading into memory. And though the path ahead was long, Elias knew he was not walking it alone. The flock moved steadily across the rolling hills, their bleats harmonizing with the gentle rustle of the grass. The storm had left the pastures refreshed, the air carrying a crispness that signaled a new beginning. Elias walked at the rear, his staff in hand, watching as the sheep spread out to graze. The two lambs he had rescued remained close to him, their trust evident in the way they followed his every step. For the first time in years, Elias felt an undeniable sense of peace. The journey through the storm, the rescue of the lambs, and the encounter with the mysterious stranger had awakened something within him. A clarity that had long been buried under guilt and regret. As the sun rose higher, Elias led the flock toward a small clearing at the edge of the pasture. This spot held significance for him. It was where his father had often brought the flock to rest, a place steeped in quiet reflection and prayer. He knelt in the grass, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The flock grazed peacefully around him, the lambs occasionally nudging his hand for attention. Reaching into his satchel, Elias retrieved the Bible. He opened it to the same passage from Luke, the words feeling as fresh and meaningful as the first time he had read them. "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." The verse resonated deeply, its message of redemption and joy filling the silence. Elias closed his eyes, allowing the words to sink into his heart. A faint rustling pulled Elias from his thoughts. He turned to see a young boy standing at the edge of the clearing, his clothes dusty and his face streaked with dirt. The boy hesitated, his wide eyes darting between Elias and the flock. In his hands, he clutched a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Are you the shepherd?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias rose slowly, his gaze softening. "I am," he said. "What brings you here, child?" The boy stepped closer, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a small, injured bird. Its wings were twisted at odd angles, and its chest rose and fell with labored breaths. Elias knelt, meeting the boy's eyes. "What happened?" he asked gently. "I found it by the stream," the boy said. "It couldn't fly, and I didn't know where else to take it." Elias studied the bird, his hands moving with care as he examined its injuries. "You did the right thing," he said. The boy's shoulders relaxed, a hint of relief crossing his face. "Can you save it?" Elias looked at the bird, then back at the boy. "We'll do our best," he said. "But its chances are better because you cared enough to bring it here." Together, they fashioned a small splint for the bird's wings, using twigs and strips of cloth. The boy watched intently, his worry evident in the way he clenched his hands. As they worked, Elias spoke of the parable of the lost sheep, sharing its message of love and redemption. The boy listened in silence, his expression thoughtful. When they finished, Elias placed the bird in a soft patch of grass, ensuring it was safe and sheltered. "All we can do now is wait," he said. The boy lingered for a moment, then looked up at Elias. "Do you think it'll fly again?" Elias smiled faintly. "Sometimes we're given second chances. We just have to trust that it'll find its way." The boy nodded, a quiet determination in his gaze. "Thank you," he said. Elias watched as the boy disappeared into the trees, his small figure blending with the shadows. Turning back to the flock, Elias felt a familiar warmth, a reminder that every life, no matter how small, was worth the effort. As the day wore on, Elias continued tending to the flock, his movements steady and purposeful. The lambs grazed contentedly, their earlier fear replaced by a sense of belonging. Elias found himself reflecting on the past, the mistakes he had made, the relationships he had neglected, and the moments of grace that had brought him here. The markers on the trail, the storm, the stranger, they were all pieces of a larger picture, a story of redemption unfolding before him. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Elias began leading the flock back toward the village. The path wound through the same forest where the storm had raged, but now it felt different, calmer, more welcoming. When he reached the village, the sight of the flock brought smiles to the faces of those gathered. Children ran to greet the sheep, their laughter filling the air. Elias paused, his gaze sweeping over the scene. For so long, he had carried the weight of his failures, believing he was unworthy of grace. But now, standing amidst the laughter and light, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, guided by love and faith. In the weeks that followed, Elias became known not just as a shepherd, but as a storyteller. He shared the tale of the storm, the lambs, and the mysterious markers, weaving it with the parable of the lost sheep. People from neighboring villages came to listen, drawn by the simplicity and power of his words. Each time he spoke, Elias felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that his story had the power to inspire others. Years later, as Elias sat by the fire in his cabin, he looked out at the pastures where the flock grazed peacefully. The lambs he had rescued had grown strong, their once fragile frames now sturdy and confident. On the mantel above the hearth, the Bible rested, its pages worn from use. Beside it was a small cross, crafted from the sticks he had found on the trail that fateful night. Elias smiled, The memories of that journey etched deeply in his heart. He knew he had been guided, not just by his own determination, but by a presence greater than himself. The boy who had brought the injured bird grew into a man, carrying the lessons he had learned from Elias into his own life. He often spoke of the shepherd who had shown him the power of compassion and faith. And though Elias's name faded with time, his story lived on, a testament to the enduring gift of redemption and the love that guides us all.